My first encounter with Flash Gordon came when I was about 6 or 7 years old. During the summer holidays, my brother used to get up at the crack of dawn and we'd make our way downstairs to watch BBC and ITV's morning lineup of kids' shows, as they cater to kids in summer holiday with the morning lineup, and not show shitty breakfast TV and antique shows like they do now. Anyway, it'll be around 8 in the morning and BBC would get their morning lineup of summer programming started with Flash Gordon movie serials made by RKO Universal Studios in the mid-1930s. Over the course of the summer, the BBC would get through all 3 serials, which comprised of Flash Gordon, the 1936 original serial, Flash Gordon's Trip to Mars, and Flash Gordon Conquers the Universe. It's fair to say that the 7-year-old me was hooked. And that was my introduction. And all I had until Star Wars came out in 1977, which of course I also got hooked on, and then the Flash Gordon movie years later. When I started to look at the history of it, I was amazed to learn that Flash Gordon was only created back in 1934 by Alex Raymond for King Features Syndicate, which had gained some success previously with The Phantom and Mandrake the Magician, who would later feature in the 80s animated show Defenders of the Earth alongside Flash Gordon. King Features wanted a space hero done in the vein of Buck Rogers, who'd premiered a few years earlier in the 1928 novella Armageddon 2419 AD by Philip Francis Nolan. To that end, they brought in writer and artist Alex Raymond, who launched Flash Gordon on January 4th of 1934. Flash Gordon was an all-American hero, and was a character who didn't have any particular superpowers beyond being an athlete at the absolute peak of fitness. He was accompanied on his adventures by discredited scientist Dr. Hans Zarkov and journalist and reporter Dale Arden. Flash was also one of the very first comic book characters to become available across various media, and it's pretty amazing how quickly this happened for the character. Having launched in early 1934, it was only 1 year and 4 months before Flash Gordon made the jump from comic book pages to radio. The first radio adventure, titled The Amazing Interplanetary Adventures of Flash Gordon, went live on April 27, 1935. Then, on April 6th the following year, 1936, the first RKO movie serial, Flash Gordon, began to entertain fans with Buster Crabbe playing the title role and the devilish-looking Charles Middleton playing the nefarious Ming the Merciless. It's interesting to note that Crabbe would also play the role of Buck Rogers in the RKO serials as well. After the Buster Crabbe serials, the character would continue in the comic book form and remain a popular character with comic book readers. Then between 1954 and 1956, a TV adaptation came out which starred an actor called Steve Holland in the title role. Set in 3203, it features the team as Galaxy Bureau of Investigation agents fighting threats, alien and non-alien. This was a joint production between the USA, France and West Germany, and it was shot in a very run-down post-war Berlin, while the German economy was recovering from the Second World War. This take on Flash Gordon ran for 39 episodes before it came to an end. Also in the 1950s, the original serials with Buster Crabbe started to air on television and were retitled somewhat for marketing reasons between 1955 and 1979. The comics and those old movie and TV productions was the only way to get your Flash Gordon fix. Then, between 1978 and 1979, US-based animation studio Filmation stepped up with an animated movie that introduced new fans to Flash Gordon. That movie would then morph into a series titled Flash Gordon: The Greatest Adventure of All. Robert Ridgely would provide his voice for the titular character, while Bob Holt voiced Dr. Zarkov, and Diane Pershing provided her talents for Dale Arden, while Vic Perrin voiced Ming the Merciless. I have fond memories of watching these animated shows just before leaving the house for school in the early 1980s. Then, in 1980, acclaimed movie producer Dino De Laurentiis released his massive movie of Flash Gordon in 1980. Directed by Mike Hodges and starring Sam J. Jones, and with a soundtrack by Queen, you'd be forgiven for thinking the movie would be a hit. But unfortunately, the box office takings were disappointing. But thankfully, the movie had a very, very long tail, as it made up for the theatrical performance when it eventually made its way onto home video. In fact, Flash Gordon was one of the very first movie VHS rentals we watched when I was a kid. In 1996, Flash Gordon made a return to the world of animation, but in a reimagined format that was geared to a much younger audience, as opposed to the more general audience the character was originally intended for. This version of the character and its world was dreamed up by David J. Corbett and Judith and Garfield Reeve-Stevens. In this version, it was Flash's parents who had found themselves trapped on Mongo, and Flash, a hoverboard enthusiast, was a teenager, along with Dale and Zarkov, who was now an old hippie who worked as a sound engineer at Woodstock. Suffice to say, when I saw an episode of this, I was not at all that impressed. And given that it only ran for 26 episodes, I'm not sure it captured the hearts of established fans, but no doubt there are kids from the 90s who will fondly remember it. But this was only a precursor for something much worse. In 2007, the Sci-Fi Channel aired a new feature-length series of Flash Gordon, which was developed by Peter Hume. This version starred Eric Johnson in the title role and co-starred Gina Holden as Dale Arden, who was once again a journalist for a TV station. But in this take, she'd broken up with Flash, who was still apparently living with his mother. Made on a very low budget, the series saw Flash using the portal system to travel back and forth between Earth and Mongo, and the story was centred on him trying to find his father, who was lost there for years prior. Suffice to say, this version of a character did not impress, particularly given how much traditional origin story had been changed, as well as the really crappy thing that they did with the Hawkmen. In short, the Hawkmen did not have wings, instead they had capes, and could only glide for short distances and not fly. It was awful. Why Flash Gordon still matters? It's funny, earlier I found myself asking whether Flash Gordon is still relevant, and you know what? In a lot of ways, he is. In fact, in some ways, more than ever. We're living in a society that feels increasingly divided, with culture wars being stoked by poisonous political figures who seem intent on pouring kerosene onto the flames. Flash Gordon stands in direct opposition to that. His story sees him arrive on a planet fractured under the rule of a dictator, where different factions and cultures are set against one another. Whether it's Prince Barin and the people of Arabia, the Lion Men, the Hawkmen, or others, they're all too busy fighting each other to see the bigger picture. Flash steps into that chaos and does something remarkably simple. He unites them. He shows them that they are stronger together than they are apart. And it's through that unity that they are ultimately able to bring down Ming the Merciless. So yeah, Flash Gordon can still be relevant. And I'm pretty sure that in the right hands, it could be brought back in such a way that it flourishes. Last I heard, Matthew Vaughn was looking at developing a new Flash Gordon movie back in 2017, but that project seems to have fallen into development hell. But I think a movie or a series could be done if they keep the original origin story as close to the Alex Raymond original as possible, and maybe update Dale's character a little bit. Make her more capable, which is how she was portrayed in the 2007 series, which is one of that version's brighter points. The story doesn't need to be changed, however, some of the characters maybe need to be modernised a little. It's also interesting to note that Flash Gordon was one of George Lucas's inspirations for the Star Wars movies.